Today, I have a very special presentation for you all. Today, we're going to be discussing the true genealogy of General George Washington, founding father of the United States. I've come across strong evidence that Washington was actually a Viking and a direct descendant of Odin, king of Asgard. I could not believe my eyes when I initially came across this information, and I think you are all going to feel the same way by the end of this video. After we reveal the evidence surrounding Washington's Viking heritage, we are also going to discuss how this context ties into the Arthurian legend of the Six Kings as foretold by Merlin, as well as the Lakota Sioux tribe's Mountain of the Six Grandfathers, now known as Mount Rushmore. So without further ado, I think it's time that we reveal what we have found. I don't think it can be overstated just how significant of a find this really is. For me, it was basically like finding the holy grail of this research. This is a book published in 1879 by Albert Wells, the then president of the American College of Genealogical Registry and Heraldry. This is a legitimate institution that has been around for centuries and still exists today. Wells's role as the president of this institution puts him in a unique position with access to genealogical records and other information that would otherwise not be accessible to the general public. The book is titled The Pedigree and History of the Washington Family, derived from Odin, the founder of Scandinavia in 70 BC, involving a period of 18 centuries and including 55 generations down to General George Washington, first president of the United States. The title itself is pretty conspicuous, but I wanted to also read the entirety of the preface so we can get a more complete understanding of the message Wells is trying to convey. He writes the following: "My position as the president of the American College for Genealogical Registry and Heraldry enables me to obtain correct pedigrees and history of foreign families, and as the English history of the Washington family by several authors has been confessedly supposititious, it is deemed important that a correct and authentic volume should be written that would become the standard for reference on this subject. My correspondent in London, from whom I have obtained the material for the Washington pedigree in England, is a lineal descendant of the progenitor in England and has been engaged in over 30 years in gathering evidence." He thus writes, "If I had not taken upon myself the great labor of examining those inestimable records, the common plea rolls, the truth of that man's great lineage would not have been revealed. They are of immense value, and I hope that you will make them known to your countrymen by publication of the Washington history. The pedigree I now send I can establish by legal evidence. The uncertainty hitherto existing in regard to the English progenitors of the Washington family, which has led to numberless and fruitless controversies among the genealogists, will be entirely removed and cleared up by this volume. Beginning with Odin, the founder of Scandinavia BC 70, the history is followed down through the royal line of Denmark in 32 generations to Thorfinn the Dane, who lived around AD 1000 and whose ancestors were of Schleswig, Denmark. He settled in Yorkshire, England prior to the Norman conquest. The descent is traced in Denmark and England from father to son, down through centuries, including branches in different shires to John Washington, the great-grandfather of General George Washington, in 20 generations from Thorfinn, with interesting personal matter regarding nearly 500 members of the family and their alliances in England and America. The family of Washington derives its name from the village of Washington, juxta Ravenworth, now called Wharton, in the parish of Kirkby Ravenworth, in the North Riding of Yorkshire. Originally Evanshire, or Ibyshore of the Romans, or Everu, afterwards Ebor, at the time of conquest, and lastly Yorkshire. The people of this part of the country were all of Scandinavian descent and spoke the same language with the Normans themselves, which was the language of the ancient Angles. The Saxons never settled here and were of a different race. The city of York had long been before that time especially a Danish city, and the chief city in all of England. With respect to the Anglo-Saxons, there were no Saxons in these parts, which were settled by the Angles, who spoke the same language as is spoken this day in these parts of Yorkshire, and all those Saxon inscriptions, about which so many wonders are made, are simply plain Yorkshire. The Angles were a branch of the Danes who lived in Schleswig, a seaport town in Denmark, and came over to England, men, women, children, beasts, and left that country desolate for 300 years, as confirmed by the Saxon Chronicles. The 174 manors given to Earl Allen by the Conqueror were only so many shadows. There were only about 6 manors really attached to the earldom of Richmondshire. Of all the others, he was merely nominally the chief lord, and each was held by an owner whose ancestor held for many generations before the conquest. There were never in Richmondshire above 6 families descended from Norman ancestors, and they acquired their lands by marrying heiresses. The growing importance and value of such a work as this is illustrated by the increasing interest in everything pertaining to General Washington, and it is, in fact, the only genealogy and family history of national importance in this country. The Bible is a history of the earliest races of mankind and a record of the Jewish lineage, religion, the science of immortality, genealogy cognate with both, inasmuch as it is a study of embracing the present life, combined with departed generations, giving results of vast import in the future, and may therefore be considered next only in importance to religion and the Bible history. The songs with which the northern bards regaled the heroes at their Feast of Shells were but versified chronicles of each ancestral line, symphonied by their stirring deeds. Through the oak's fire uncertain flame the chieftain saw descend the shadowy forms of his fathers. They came from the halls of Odin, as the harper swept the strings, and deployed before their descendant, rejoicing in the sound of their praise. No parchment told his lineage to the warrior of those days, but the heroic names were branded each night upon his swelling heart by the burning number of the bards. Thus did the Northman chronicle his ancestry in those unlettered times. Afterwards, when the oak fire was extinguished, the shell thrown by, and the night came no more with songs, when we reach the age of records, we find this love of lineage availing itself of the new method of commemoration. This strong ancestral spirit of the Northmen may be traced partially to the profound sentiment of perpetuity, which formed the principal and noblest elements of his character, and partly to the nature of the property to which he was linked by immemorial customs of the race. The family history or record of the sovereigns of the world before Christ furnish almost the only histories of the countries over which they reigned, as Egypt, Chaldea, Babylonia, and Greece. The Chinese annals, the most ancient known, were written with the most perfect exactness and preserved with the greatest care, composed originally by order of the emperors, each of whom, on his ascension to the throne, commanded the acts of his predecessors to be written by some learned philosopher, so that the whole forms one uniform, continued series of the history of the ancient Chinese Empire, from the beginning of the monarchy in 25,038 BC for some thousands of years. And thus was the history of China obtained and preserved more correctly, and for a longer period than that of any other nation in the world. Had not the Hebrew race cherished this love of kindred and lineage, we would not have any Bible today. And to this feeling, we owe our knowledge of the history of the most ancient kingdoms of the world and most of our modern history. The English registers have, for upwards of 1,000 years, been the protection and authority of many families and the means of preserving large property interests. So there's clearly a lot of information here to dissect, but fundamentally what Wells is telling us in this book is that Washington was a descendant of Thorfinn the Dane, who founded the Washington family in England, and Thorfinn was a direct descendant of Odin, the son of Fridolf, supreme ruler of Scythians in Azaland or Azaheim Turkestan between the Euxine and Caspian seas in Asia. Odin reigned at Asgard and became the first king of Scandinavia in 70 BC. He died in 50 BC and was replaced by his sons. This is a fascinating subject that isn't covered in mainstream history classes or textbooks. In mainstream historical canon, Odin is often dismissed as a myth. However, in Norse mythology, Odin is depicted as a divine being with supernatural abilities, deeply woven into various myths and legends. He is portrayed as a complex and multifaceted god, playing a significant role in the creation of the world and humanity according to Norse beliefs. This text has clarified some aspects of the past for me, but has also opened the door to numerous other questions and uncertainties as well. Could Odin be one of these Anunnaki beings or deities we've learned so much about recently, similar to Thoth the Atlantean or Quetzalcoatl in Mexico? Was George Washington actually a descendant of a literal deity, or was Odin the Allfather really just a regular man? Regardless of the answer to these questions, this book presents a crucial piece of evidence to consider when examining the history of our nation, as well as the Greco-Roman structures we find scattered across America today. Many of these structures feature Viking or longship symbolism, raising questions about their true origins. Did the Vikings after Leif Erikson build some of these structures before Columbus even arrived on the continent? And were these buildings actually just reattributed by the Europeans in the 19th and 20th centuries? Let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section below. Now let's take a moment to discuss how Washington's Viking heritage may tie into Merlin the Magician's legend of the Six Kings, as well as the Native American mythos of the Six Grandfathers Mountain. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's History Regum Britanniae, Merlin is depicted as a powerful wizard and prophet who predicts the rise and fall of various kings in England. According to the legend, Merlin foretold the reigns of 6 kings who would follow King Arthur, emphasizing their influence on the future of Britain and the world at large. Here's where things get really interesting. If you examine the etymology of the word Viking, you will notice the VI in Viking stands for the number 6 in Roman numerals. This begs the question, does the word Viking really just mean the 6 kings? Are the Vikings really just the descendants of the 6 kings that were prophesied by Merlin? This theory coincides also with the Lakota Sioux legend of the Six Grandfathers Mountain, which was the name given to Mount Rushmore before it was allegedly carved by Gutzon Borglum in the 1920s. We do know that Rushmore initially had more than 4 faces on it, as seen in pictures where they claimed it was supposed to be Jefferson, but then they removed it because they didn't like the placement. Then on closer inspection, we realized this 5th face doesn't look like Jefferson at all. So who was this 5th face on Mount Rushmore really? And was there actually 6 faces on the mountain originally, the 6 grandfathers, before Gutzon Borglum even began his work? The fact that Washington's face is on this mountain, who we have just discovered was actually a Viking, adds fuel to this idea. Is it possible that Mount Rushmore was originally a monument to the Vikings, those 6 kings which Merlin prophesied to King Arthur? I personally suspect there is some sort of connection here between the Vikings, the Six Grandfathers Mountain, and the Arthurian legend. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. One other source I wanted to share today regarding this topic is the manifesto of Mitchell Heisman. Heisman was a 35-year-old man who unalived himself on September 18, 2010 in Harvard Yard in front of a tour group of more than 20 people. How tragic. He had just finished writing a 1,905-page book after having spent years studying various historic texts in Harvard Library. His writings do immediately go off the rails quite a bit, but the piece overall is very well cited, and I found one particular excerpt surrounding Washington very intriguing, and I think you will too. He writes the following. According to one source, the very first Washington in England was originally named William Fitzpatrick, Norman French for the son of Patrick. He changed his name to William de Wessington when he adopted the name of the parish in which he lived circa 1180 AD. Another source, the late English specialist in Norman genealogy L.G. Pine, related that George Washington and his family quote, has plenty of Norman ancestry, end quote. He confirmed that this family was on record as owners of Washington Manor in Durhamshire in the 12th century and of knightly rank. Since George Washington was the possessor of, quote, a carefully traced descendant from Edward I, this implies that the first president of the United States was also a descendant of William the Conqueror. None other than the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, affirmed in his biography of Washington that his Cavalier ancestors, quote, hated the Puritans, and that the first Washingtons in Virginia were born of a, quote, stock whose loyalty was as old as the conquest. They came of a Norman family. George Washington was a Norman American and a classic representative of the aristocratic, slave-owning Cavalier culture of Virginia. Unfortunately for Mr. Washington, Samuel Huntington has no room for this kind of diversity represented by America's first president and his Puritan-hating Cavalier ancestors. Everyone must conform to the Anglo-Saxon Puritan cultural model if they want to be counted as real Americans, even George Washington. Wasn't that what the Civil War was about? How is it even conceivable that Norman conquerors who developed into Southern slave masters could have also played a decisive role in the architecture of American liberty? Huntington, so keen to stress the English roots of American liberty, neglected to point out that the Magna Carta was a product of Norman aristocratic civilization. It was the Normans who first invented the formal tradition of constitutional liberty that eventually conquered the world. So while Washington was an heir to Norman aristocratic tradition, Magna Carta was a part of that tradition. Southern resistance to King George III in 1776 could trace its struggle for liberty to the resistance of Norman barons to King John in 1215. and this also preserved their special privileges or liberties against the tide of assimilation with Anglo-Saxons. It was only in the 17th century that Anglo-Saxons exploited and selectively reinterpreted Magna Carta for their own purposes. The ultimate foil of Hugh M. Thomas's thesis that ethnic hostility between Normans and Anglo-Saxon went extinct by about 1220 is to be found in the endurance and persistence of Samuel Huntington's question, who are we? The universalism of the American founding actually emerged out of the attempt to preserve a rather peculiar form of multiculturalism that balanced the democracy-leaning North against an aristocracy-leaning, slave-owning South. The American Civil War resulted in the northern conquest of the multicultural America that formed the character of the American founding. The Anglo-Saxon conquest of 1865 was the real founding of Samuel Huntington's presumption of a single Puritan-based American culture. What Hugh Thomas actually did was dig up the root of the Anglo-Saxon cultural identity imperialism that late 20th century multiculturalism began to expose. Thomas's conclusion that the Anglo-Saxons culturally conquered the Normans in the 13th century was made seemingly plausible only by the 19th century conquests of the Normans. Thomas only uncovered the origin of this Anglo-Saxon way of cultural conquest through a struggle against the multicultural England of medieval times. Multiculturalists who have promoted the contributions of women and minorities at the expense of the usual dead white males of history are following directly in the footsteps of Anglo-Saxon historians who downplay the Norman impact on their history. The underdog biases of multiculturalism are not an aberration, but only a continuation of the majoritarian bias of democracy itself against a fair assessment of the contributions of Norman aristocracy to world history. William the Conqueror is the ultimate dead white European male in the history of the English-speaking world. Hugh Thomas's unspoken assumption is that Anglo-Saxons culturally conquered the Norman conquest. They, the Anglo-Saxons, were ultimately history's great conquerors. But is this true? Let this point resound around the entire world with utmost clarity. The issue here is who conquered whom. Did the Normans become victims of conquest by the Anglo-Saxons in modern times through characteristically modern methods? Is it possible that Anglo-Saxons might possibly be biased on the subject of the people who once defeated, conquered, and subjugated them? Most humans have submitted to the yoke of a modern Anglo-Saxon-leaning interpretation of long-term effects of the Norman conquest. The repression of the impact of 1066 upon modern times has stifled a rational, evolutionary understanding of liberal democracy in the English-speaking world. The time has come for America and the rest of the English-speaking world to overcome this ancient blood feud and reclaim its Norman heritage, a heritage that goes to the very heart of the American founding. In modern times, the Anglo-Saxon culturally conquered the Normans by Saxoning away their multicultural difference in presumptions of Anglo-Saxon universalism. To call America Anglo-Saxon is thus tantamount to ethnically cleansing George Washington of his Norman or Cavalier ancestral identity. Was George Washington the victim of a cultural form of ethnic cleansing by the Anglo-Saxon people? This piece is incredibly thought-provoking to me. Heisman is essentially arguing that George Washington was a Norman Viking as opposed to a Danish Viking as suggested by Wells' genealogy. Heisman argues that the broader Norman Viking influence on American history has been overlooked or downplayed by mainstream historical narratives which favor an Anglo-Saxon perspective. This Anglo-Saxon bias has shaped the understanding of American liberty and identity, neglecting the significant contributions of Norman traditions such as the Magna Carta to constitutional liberty. He also contends that the true multicultural roots of America's founding, which included both Norman and Anglo-Saxon elements, were obscured by the dominance of an Anglo-Saxon cultural narrative, especially following the Civil War. We'll dive into that idea more in a future video. One final thing before we end today, the reason I circled the North Star in the Emanuel Lutz painting in the thumbnail of Washington crossing the Delaware is because that star bore a special significance to the Vikings. They believe that star was the star of Odin, and the Big Dipper is Odin's chariot. So the fact that this star appears subtly in the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware is no coincidence in my opinion. Anyways, that's all for today. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Have a great day, and God bless.